up, guys? It's Larry, and this is the Ethical Atheist, and today we're going to do something a little different. We don't have a topic of the day. We're going to play a game, and this game is called Christian 20 Questions. So I found this list of 20 questions on a Christian blog that was targeted to atheists. And it basically says that something along the lines of they have never heard atheists effectively answer these questions. So I thought I'd give it a go, but right out of the gate I'm going to disappoint everybody because the first 3 questions don't really have answers. So, question number 1, what caused the universe to exist? I don't know. Question number 2, what explains the fine-tuning of the universe? I don't know. Why is the universe rational? I don't know, but apparently NASA thinks it has something to do with dark matter. I'll post links below because the articles are actually really cool, but other than that, I don't know. Question number 4. How did DNA and amino acids arise? Well, so as I understand it, a long time ago in the primordial ooze, there were tons of different organic elements floating around, and these elements sort of over time formed proteins, and the proteins over time formed longer chains of proteins, and over time those longer chains of proteins formed even longer chains of proteins, which eventually became proto-RNA, or something along those lines. And from that initial self-replicating RNA, everything on Earth came to be, I think. So, question number 5. Where did the genetic code come from? This is definitely a pointed question coming from a theist perspective, because it's already assuming that DNA is a code like computer code, so it had to have been coded by someone or something, and I just don't think that that's a good way to phrase that question. It's perfectly fine to ask, by what mechanisms did certain genes arise, yada yada, what's the history of the genetic code, but asking where the code came from is just a defunct question in the first place. So, question number 6. How do irreducibly complex enzyme chains evolve? This one I had to look up because I had never even heard this phrase before in my life. But what it basically comes down to is that intelligent design proponents have pointed out certain things that to them seem like could never have evolved on their own. Things that it's too complex and on a molecular scale that it could have ever occurred naturally, and my response to that is that it had 4.1 billion years to occur just by brute force chance. And that's basically the explanation for all of the irreducible complexity arguments. They're saying the eyeball could never have evolved, but we have all kinds of evidence saying that eyes evolved from, the eye spots of planaria that were basically just a nerve that could sense light, all the way to, how shark eyes function, to how reptile eyes function, and eventually working their way up in complexity up to something like the human eye, which isn't even the most evolved eye on the planet. So, irreducible complexity is just not a good argument. Question number 7. How do we account for the origin of 116 distinct language families? Well, this is an easy question. I'm not even the most educated person I know, and this is an easy question. So basically, humans, way back in the day, before we had cars and planes and boats and trains, were isolated in relatively small communities and city-states before, the exchange of culture became a big thing. So each culture, in its isolated little bubble, came up with a unique language. So, communities that were isolated in the Himalayan mountain chains developed distinct languages from the peoples in China, who had free communication with each other, because they were separated and came up with their language independently. Same thing goes for, Native Americans. They had a separate and distinct language from Europeans because they hadn't had contact with them for thousands of years. Because when all you have is horses, getting across the Atlantic is a bit of a chore. Question number 8. Why did cities suddenly appear all over the world between 3000 and 1000 BC? Now, if this is referring to, like, the first cities starting to appear on the Earth, it's just a factually incorrect premise, because the first cities appeared anywhere between 5000 and 7500 years BCE. So, if they're talking about the original, like, first cities on Earth in Mesopotamia and China, they're just wrong in the premise of the question. And in these cases, this is because man had developed agriculture and no longer relied on a nomadic hunter-gatherer strategy to survive. They began cultivating vegetables and taking care of livestock, and so they were able to settle in one place and have a reliable source of food. Question number 9. How is independent thought possible in a world ruled by chance and necessity? And frankly, I'm going to admit here that I don't understand what this question is asking. There's another question on this list asking about free will and decision-making, and it's much more clearly worded. I'm not sure what this question wants from me. Just because the universe is random and filled with chance doesn't mean that, we can't think, because I'm thinking right now, and I'm thinking about how confused this question is making me. Question number 10. How do we account for self-awareness? Well, self-awareness is basically just us thinking about ourselves, right? So that basically just means we're intelligent enough that we understand ourselves and our actions. So the answer to this question is that we evolved to have a big enough brain that we could be self-aware. Question number 11. How is free will possible in a material universe? I don't know that the universe being material has a lot to do with whether or not free will exists, but there are excellent arguments to be made as to whether or not it actually does. See, the determinist position is that basically everything that we do is reactionary, and even as highly intelligent and evolved as we are, our neurochemical pathways are forged only for survival, so every decision that we make is just what our brain thinks will make us live longer. So that's the determinist position, and if you're not a determinist, well then you just believe that you have free will because you're intelligent and you can make decisions. It really has very little to do with what the universe is made of. Number 12. How do we account for conscience? Well, when I do bad things to people, I feel bad. And that's kind of the end of that. Question number 13. On what basis can we make moral judgments? Well, if you're on my channel, chances are you've seen my Ethical Atheist Gold Standard video, and if you haven't, you should. Links in the description below. But basically, my standard for determining ethical behavior is 1. How does it affect you? 2. How does it affect the people around you? 3. How does it affect society and or the planet? And if it benefits you without hurting anybody else, then it's an acceptable thing to do. And everything kind of cascades down from that point. Question number 14. Why does suffering matter? Because it does. Because it hurts my heart when people are in pain. Does it need to have a more complex explanation than that? Question number 15. Why do human beings matter? Because I'm a human being, and if I want people to treat me a certain way, I have to abide by a certain standard. Was the person that wrote this a robot? Question number 16. Why care about justice? Well, this is basically the same question as the question before it. If I want justice enacted upon me, I have to enact justice upon other people. That's kind of how society works. Question number 17. How do we account for the almost universal belief in the supernatural? Well, I'm sure to proto-man, who had no idea what protons and electrons were, or an electrical charge was, seeing lightning come crashing down from the sky and set stuff on fire was pretty frickin' amazing. And not knowing what protons, electrons, or an electrical charge is, they logically drew the conclusion that that powerful force must have come from somewhere. And not knowing what that powerful force was, bada bing, bada boom, God. Now, I'm sure that there are tons of different versions of this based on the natural phenomenon that proto-man saw, but basically what it boils down to is that there have always been things that we don't know how to explain because we don't currently have the scientific evidence to explain it. But as we move through history and we do learn a lot about the natural world through scientific study, those beliefs become less and less common. So, there you go. Question number 18. How do we know the supernatural does not exist? I have never experienced anything supernatural in my life. Yes, that is anecdotal evidence, but there are also many other people who would attest that they had never experienced anything supernatural in their life. And until I do experience something supernatural, I reserve the right not to believe in it. Question number 19. How can we know if there is conscious existence after death? Anybody with a shred of intellectual honesty would say that we can't know if there's conscious existence after death, because we can't observe that. And if we can't observe it, we can't draw conclusions about it. My position on the afterlife isn't so much that I definitely know that there isn't one, it's that I have never been presented evidence in my life that suggests that there is one. Question number 20. What accounts for the empty tomb, resurrection, and appearances and growth of the church? And this, of course, refers to the empty tomb of Jesus, the resurrection, and all the stuff that he supposedly did after that. And my response to this is that there are no corroborating historical documents from the time that say any of that happened. There is no document other than the Bible that references Jesus' execution, burial, and subsequent resurrection. So, purely from a historical perspective, it doesn't appear as if he ever existed. And there were many, many historians contemporary to him. I'll link a list below. But there are no mentions of Jesus in the common culture until something 70 to 80 years after he supposedly died, and the Romans were obsessively anal about writing everything down. So, basically, there's no evidence that any of that happened. Now, the appearance and the growth of the church, that has a lot to do with the culture of Christianity growing around the time, and honestly, if Jesus never existed, I don't know where the myth came from, and I don't know why it was spread. But I also don't believe that Muhammad exists. Well, hold on. Muhammad did exist. We have proof that he existed. So Islam has a leg up on you. How do you feel about that? So that was Christian 20 Questions. I'll link the original blog site below. I really enjoyed this video, and I'd love to hear what some of your guys' answers are to all these questions, and I'd love to hear additional questions that are supposedly difficult to answer. So, thank you very much for watching, and as always, may Darwin be with you.